So there were many foreign aid programs developed in the period after the Second World War, and their aim was to help the countries who receive them to stabilize their economy in order to give them a bigger chance to develop economic-wise. Firstly, we need to define what is foreign aid. Foreign aid is international transfer of capitals, goods and services from one country to another, with the country receiver benefiting from it. So there are two views of foreign aid. There is a positive view and there is a radical view. Positive view saying that the foreign aid helps the countries to develop and it is actually being useful. And the radical view basically being that the foreign aid is useless to the countries because they are unable to develop their own economy. However, there is also another measure that we can use, which is called foreign direct investment, which is when one investor is sending the money to a business in a different country and does enough process or sends enough money in order to become a controlling shareholder. So the aim of this project is not only to assess which view of the foreign aid is correct, whether it helps the countries or not. Also, another aim is to look at these two variables, the foreign aid and foreign direct investment, and see which one is the best for evaluation of the GDP growth within the country and which one best determines it.
Okay, so as we see here, we're in the year 1985, with most of the bubbles representing the countries all in the same area with low FDIs, low aid, and varying stages of economic growth. Most African countries at this point have achieved independence. The IMF and World Bank are pretty much coming in with structural adjustment policies which are very controversial. Pakistan is seeing very low economic growth at this point, due in part to the Pressler Amendment made in the United States, which barred aid and military assistance to them. Unless explicitly allowed by the president. So this pretty much caused the GDP growth to go from 6% to 1.2% in nothing. The year is 2009. As you see, the financial crisis of 2008 is taking its toll even on these developing economies, as you can see by shrinking bubble sizes. So we see certain outliers such as Tanzania and Pakistan receiving more amount of aid than the others. Also, the bubble size of Tanzania can be seen as quite big compared to the others. This was in part due to the $300 million loan by the IMF to more or less absorb some of this financial crisis shock. And then we also see Chile receiving higher FDI than the rest. So the year is 2011. The year previous to this one, the East African community opened their customs union, which should have led to more intra-customs union trade between the member states. So that's Tanzania, Kenya, etc. We see one outlier of DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, in terms of aid. This is because in the same year they received from the IMF $12.3 billion in aid. Pakistan also has high aid levels. This was due to catastrophic floods in the region at the time.
In this graph, we can see the relationship between aid as a percentage of GDP and GDP growth for all regions. As we can see, there's a higher percentage of aid as a percentage of GDP than GDP growth. Aid is more dispersed and it's always positive, while GDP is more condensed and it has some outliers with negative values. In the second graph, we can see the relationship between FDI and GDP growth for all regions. As we can see, these two parameters are more similar than in the first graph. They have more or less the same values, except that GDP growth has some outliers with negative values. So in this table, we can see the correlation and covariance of the relationship between aid and GDP growth and FDI and GDP growth. For the three regions that we chose, that's Africa, America, and Asia. Africa and America in aid, they have negative values for both correlation and covariance, while Asia has nearly zero correlation and covariance. So it's a really weak relation. While FDI has also a weak relation, In the correlation, it's nearly 0.5, but it's still not there. And the covariance, it's really, really small, nearly insignificant, but not negative.
Should a country solely rely on FDI for its GDP growth? We're going to answer this question by assessing the probability that Uganda receives an FDI that is between 1.7 and 3.19, which is an acceptable FDI range for generating GDP growth. This will then be assessed for a certain time period. Let's see.
We then calculated the population proportion, which equals 0.02. Our next step was to calculate the standard error. Finally, we inserted the standard error into our proportion mean calculation in order to obtain the corresponding two values. We found that there was a 14.58% chance of the FDI as a percentage of GDP being between 1.7 and 3.19.
Therefore, we can conclude that Uganda would need to plan its GDP growth and plans and objectives around other avenues, since the probability of its FDI is significantly small in order to obtain a relatively good FDI.
We were interested in seeing how trade agreements affect a country's FDI influx. And to do this, we're going to take a closer view at the East African Community Agreement. So first of all, we're going to compute the probability of Uganda's FDI being greater than regional average, given that Tanzania's FDI is also greater than regional average. Both Uganda and Tanzania are members of the East African Community.
We found this probability to be 0.6, which alludes to a positive trend. This suggests that a symbiotic relationship for FDI of East African community countries within the African region of the study.
To further prove this symbiotic relationship, we are also going to compute the probability that the FDI in Zimbabwe, which is not an East African community member, is less than regional average, given that the FDI of Tanzania, an East African community member, is greater than regional average.
Here, we found the probability to be 93%, which further confirms the existence of a symbiotic relationship between FDI influx and trade agreements, like in this case in the East African community.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the show The World Bank Says. We are here tonight to test claims of the World Bank, and therefore joining us tonight is Mr. Ron Fisher, a famous and renowned statistician. Give him a round of applause. We will first hear a claim of the World Bank, and then we will have Mr. Fisher calculating it using hypothesis testing. The World Bank claims the following: Rwanda's population variance in aid as a percentage of GDP is at most 3%. This is true according to Mr. Fisher, as it fails to reject the null hypothesis. Our second claim is that between the years 1994 and 2012, the average population mean of foreign direct investment as a percentage of GDP of Uganda is 2.04%. And this is, according to Mr. Fisher, false, because the null hypothesis is rejected. And concluding our last claim, in Venezuela, the average population mean of foreign direct investment as a percentage of GDP is at least 1.02% for the years 1988 until 2014. And Mr. Fisher says it is true, because it fails to reject the null hypothesis. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight was an epic show, and we will see each other next week for our next episode of The World Bank Says. Thank you, everybody, and good night.